Hello, welcome back to Talktoptera number 2 with Becca Nelson. Tucker, first we'll provide a few excitatory words, share a little bit about our enthusiasm for this encounter, and then Becca will go through several different exciting domains of science and art and poetry. So, Tucker, please.
Yeah, so we had the pleasure of working with Becca during her undergraduate studies and during Daniel's PhD studies at Stanford, particularly doing field research out at the Southwest Research Station on the border of Arizona and New Mexico. And we've always been struck by her interest in both observational field science and entomology, and her passion for converting that, sharing that in artistic forms like poetry and illustration. So she's going to walk us through her research and her academic career and where she sees the field of entomology as a whole going and where she'd like to take her own career path forward as well. So Becca, as you'd like, take us along your academic history, what you're working on, and what you hope to be working on.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here in conversation today. Yeah, I guess to start, would it be helpful for me to just kind of give a little overview of like my journey into science and career path? Well, I grew up a little bit outside of Chicago and um, had the fortune of when I was sort of at a formative age in high school getting to participate in a program called Science Olympiad. That if you're not familiar with it, it's awesome. It's a science competition for middle schoolers and high schoolers that covers like a broad range of different topics in STEM. And one of the events that I did as part of that competition was called entomology. And it was all about how do you identify different groups of insects to order and family, and how do you learn about their ecology, what is sort of the impact that they have on people, and what impacts do people have on them. And it just like opened up this whole world of exploration for me because I began to learn about all these amazing different types of insects that I had never heard of, like shiny metallic tiger beetles and ants and really neat metallic kinds of sweat bees. And yeah, I hadn't up until that point really had any sense that you could have a career focused on studying and interacting with cool insects, and that there's this whole body of literature around the science of insects. So that having that experience at sort of a younger age, when I then went on to be an undergrad at Stanford, which is where I initially met y'all. I ended up joining Deborah Gordon's lab on ant behavioral ecology because I thought social insects are amazing and incredible, and I was eager to gain some field experiences, learning how to do field work and how to really watch insects and understand their behavior. So that kind of some of those undergrad research experiences I had and wonderful mentors that I had to work with were like then kind of led me to want to pursue a PhD in ecology and then merge my two interests, which are insects and plants, together to then study how plants and pollinators respond to different human impacts on the environment. Once I was a PhD student at the University of California, Davis.
Yeah, if I could ask a question, and perhaps you'll broach this in when you share some of the research that you've been doing, because there's human impacts on the environment like deforestation, but there's also natural impacts, which I imagine are similar and can also inform the research. Like I'm thinking of forest fires or other natural disasters. Are you able to incorporate that into your research to see how animals respond in those situations and whether it's the same or different with human
Yeah, that's
involvement?
a great question. Yeah, no, I think there's definitely opportunities for that. Like, one area theme of my research is that the world is very patchy in the sense that you have a lot of different types of soils and plants and ecosystems, and it's not like within a landscape, everything's the same. You have so much spatial variation, and some of that spatial variation can be sometimes directly affected by human actions on the environment, like fragmentation of different land use changes with like things like using land for agriculture instead of keeping it more wild. But then there's also sometimes like differences just in the geology of the landscape that create these different soil types that are more driven by geology. And my research explores some of those different ways of creating patchiness and its effects on pollinators and sort of the interaction between some of that existing geologic variation as well as human impacts like introducing weedy species into landscapes.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, feel free to get started on your presentation now, and I'll try not to ask too many questions.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, and if y'all do have questions, like I want this to, yeah, it can totally be conversational, so feel free to interrupt, but I thought I'd make things a little more free form, but also just kind of provide sort of an introduction to some of my main focal research, which has taken place primarily in California grasslands, as well as some of the questions that really excite me about insects. So broadly, yeah, I'm now at the phase where I'm currently a postdoc researcher at Utah State. So I recently finished my PhD at Davis, and I think a lot of the questions that really light me up when it comes to wanting to pursue entomology research are thinking about mutualisms, because mutualisms or interactions that are reciprocally beneficial to both of the species involved have been relatively understudied within the community ecology literature, especially compared to things like competition or predation. And there's this kind of paradox that exists within the realm of ecology, that we have these amazingly diverse communities of mutualistic organisms, like for instance, the photo in my Zoom background is from the super bloom at Table Mountain in Oroville, California. And if you were to go to a place like Table Mountain, you would find yourself walking in a meadow surrounded by all sorts of different colors of flowers, different species of flowers, different shapes. And each of those different shapes and colors of flowers might appeal to slightly differing species or groups of pollinators that are then visiting the flowers and helping them reproduce, and in exchange getting some nectar and pollen to eat as food resources. But yeah, it's this paradox because you see this incredible diversity of these plant pollinator interactions, but it kind of goes against some of the predictions within ecological theory that you would think that more diversity might make it harder to like how are these interactions still stable, like what processes maintain these interactions. There's still a lot to be understood about like how diverse mutualisms are stable. And so in relation to that, I got really curious about what ecological processes maintain diverse mutualistic communities, and how do they respond to anthropogenic perturbations, or in other words, how do they respond to the ways in which we as people impact the environment? Yeah, and kind of just like a general framework for thinking about these sorts of questions. My research has really tried to approach this question of like, how do mutualisms respond to these global changes across different scales and also with different types of global changes? Because I think where ecology and also entomology as areas of research are going is the need for more integration, both of theoretical models with data-driven approaches, which my work explores, as well as really thinking about how do these processes play out across different scales of biological organization, and how do these many different impacts that people have on the environment interact to affect pollinators, and what can we do to make sure that there's still plenty of pollinators around to benefit crops as well as wild plant reproduction. So for instance, I've tried to explore these questions at a range of different scales, but looking at sort of plant population responses to climate change, all the way up to looking at more macro ecological patterns and how wildflowers across the entire globe are responding to human impacts on the environment. And then also thinking about this in terms of how different human impacts on the environment might be acting in concert with each other. So a few of the different impacts that my work explores on pollinators are looking at the effects of things such as climate change, eutrophication or the deposition of extra nutrients into the environment, defaunation or the loss of large wild mammals that are these essential herbivores in a lot of grasslands, the introduction of weedy or invasive plant species. And then I have a new line of research that I'm setting up with a postdoc fellowship that I'm starting at Michigan State that's going to be exploring how agricultural land use changes further affect pollinators. And in thinking about these mutualisms, I often think about the insects interacting with the flower, but there's also this whole hidden world of floral microbes that live on the surfaces of the flower and in the nectar. And pollinators often act as little vectors that shuttle these microbes around between the flowers, where they then live in sort of these ephemeral patches of nectar. So increasingly, through some wonderful collaborations I have with microbial ecologists, I've been starting to explore further what role do these microbes as silent additional partners to the mutualism play in further shaping how these plant pollinator mutualisms are responding to global changes across these different scales. Yeah, I feel like that was like definitely a lot of information. Do y'all have any like questions or thoughts on that so far?
Yeah, incredibly dense little graphic right here. Some of the initial thoughts I had listening to you speak are um, regarding eutrophication. I imagine some of these can be pathological or damaging, like dumping nitrogen-based fertilizers into an aquatic or marshland ecosystem and having algal blooms that snowballs into affecting fish populations and therefore the insects that the fish eat, etc. But I could also imagine they could be remedial, like in a damaged landscape, they might want to introduce lost macronutrients so that the ants, bugs, bees, insects, flowers can return. So do you have any insight there? And then the second one was, I cannot wait to hear more about the microbial ecosystems of nectar. Never even crossed my mind. And I would love to hear what you've learned, any insights there, because that's awesome.
Thank you so much, Tucker. Yeah, to address the first question, I think like yeah, there's definitely different ways that like nutrients are moving, and I feel like I haven't done as much work directly in the space of more like nutrient addition as like a remedial process, but I know that that definitely is the case, especially in certain ecosystems where the nutrients have really been depleted by different processes. But what I have focused more of my attention on is like cases where you dump too much fertilizer into an ecosystem because for a lot of cases we've sort of kind of surpassed the tipping point to how much fertilizer and related nutrients like nitrogen have been added into systems. So, yeah, I'd say more of my work has kind of been in the space of like when you add a bunch of extra fertilizer into ecosystems, what does that do to the plants? And I think the question that's often less explored is given what we know about what it does to the plants, what are the then downstream consequences for insects, particularly pollinators and their webs of interaction with the plants? And then for the microbes work that I'm doing, to address your second question, I have an ongoing collaboration with Dr. Jillian Bergman, who recently defended her PhD at UC Davis and was working with Rachel Vanette. And together we've been looking at how floral microbes in certain types of plants are affected by spatial variation within the landscape. So I talked a little bit before about how I'm really interested in the inherent patchiness of landscapes, because I feel like within entomology and ecology as fields of study, it's sometimes the easy thing to do is draw these neat little boxes around ecosystems and be like, this is one ecosystem, this is another ecosystem. I'm going to just focus on the insects in this ecosystem and not really think about what's surrounding it. But insects like to move around a lot, especially bees as pollinators. They're often foraging across great distances in the landscape and really responding to fine scale spatial variation, and where are there a bunch of flowers, or where are certain types of flowers that they're excited about. And when they're doing that, they're often shuttling microbes along as little hitchhikers, and some of these microbes might be beneficial for the health of the plant and the pollinator, and others of these microbes might be pathogens. And there's been some work by Rachel Vanette and Tad Fukami in particular showing that like the presence of some of these microbes can really affect potentially the outcome of pollination as a biological interaction by making the nectar either less appealing to the insects or making the nectar more appealing, and then insect pollinators as well as hummingbird pollinators can then potentially respond to these microbe driven changes in the nectar when they're deciding which flowers they want to visit. So there's been a lot of amazing work already out there about that, but I was more curious, like when you have landscapes that have different types of soil patches and different plant communities, how much does that spatial variation in the plants also explain the community diversity and composition of fungi? Because I think like the microbial fungi that live on the surface of flowers and in the nectar have been particularly understudied. Like there's still a lot that we don't know about their basic natural history, their potential relationships, both bad and good, with insects. But these floral fungi potentially have a lot of implications for like how well a plant might reproduce in terms of the outcome of pollination, or they might potentially be pathogens that could affect pollinators. So I think it's really important that we have a better understanding of the fungi. So yeah, essentially we have different patches of flowers that grow on different soils, and I'll talk a little more about my different soil types a little later. And we looked at the whole micro community of like the entire surface of the flower, and found that like there's sort of correlations between sort of how much invasive plants there are within a certain patch, and what sorts of fungi we get on the flower. And we're still kind of in the process of unpacking some of our findings, but that's kind of the general gist of what my work has been so far with the microbes, is that we're really curious, like, yeah, do some of these changes in plant species and sort of the spatial configuration of plants in the landscape, and then also how many pollinators are visiting these plants, does that correlate with how much floral fungi we get and what sorts of types of fungi are found on the surfaces of the flowers?
Yeah, that is so fascinating. I don't know if it comes up again later in your presentation where you'll be able to share more, but I'll just ask a few more questions. Do you know about, because you're talking about patches in the landscape, and I'm thinking about all these little nectar bowls on a tree or flowering plant, and those are like patches within the patch, because each one of those could have a different microbial signature, and then that could vary across a single landscape and across a region and across the globe. So like these little tiny balls, little tiny worlds within themselves. And to give a more specific question, do you know if these microbial communities are endogenous to the plant, like the plant injects them, so to speak, into the nectar as part of a push or pull for pollinators? Or, sorry, I have my nieces here and they're talking in the background, but or are they just sort of opportunistic microbes that are flying in the air like yeasts that eventually land on a wet nectar ball, and that's how it happens?
That's a wonderful question, and I think there's still a lot to be understood, but I think it's a mix of both. Like there's some microbes that like through like flowers can then, for instance, get transmitted to seeds. And similarly, there might be microbes already associated with non-reproductive parts of the plant that then can get into the flower. That's more of like an endogenous mechanism, as you described. But then also, I think they're highly opportunistic. Like they're often the air is transporting all sorts of microbes more passively through the landscape. And then you have pollinators as this really interesting um, way of transporting the microbes because, yeah, often the pollinators are making more like informed decisions about where they want to forage. And then there's often cases where you get microbes that are associated with pollinators that the pollinators are then distributing between different flowers. So, like things like insect behavior, like is the pollinator switching between a lot of different flower species, or does it have a favorite type of flower and it's going to visit that same flower over and over again when it's moving through a meadow? That potentially can have a big impact on what sorts of microbes end up on the a flower. And I feel like we're only just sort of beginning to understand the implications of that. And there's still a lot of exciting avenues for research to really sort of unpack sort of the relationship between pollinator behavior and these microbes, and even to what extent like pollinators are moving the microbes versus wind or water. And also we know very little about even how far can the microbes go from one plant to another, given that they might be more short-lived. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of need for more technology to better trace sort of the flow of microbes between the different flowers as well. So yeah, lots of exciting avenues.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you. Please continue. Or Dan, if you have something to share.
Yeah. Thanks, Becca. You can go through all the slides for the science part first, and then we'll reflect.
Cool. Great. So I just kind of wanted to share sort of a bit more about one of the main systems that I've had the privilege of working in, which are serpentine grasslands. So if you're not familiar with serpentine grasslands, they're kind of like sort of the equivalent of coral reefs, but for terrestrial ecosystems, because serpentine grasslands harbor a disproportionately high amount of California's plant diversity. And the reason for this is traces back to a lot of the geologic upheaval that really built California as a landscape. So serpentine grasslands, the reason they're called serpentine is they have serpentine soils that are derived from the special type of rock called serpentinite. And this rock is really particularly associated with forming when tectonic plates smush together and slide underneath each other. So because serpentinite often will only form under these special tectonic conditions, there's only a handful of places on Earth where you can find serpentinite rock. And we're really lucky that California is one of them. And because this rock is sort of unique, it tends to have the soil tends to have a lack of a lot of the basic nutrients that plants need to grow. And it also tends to be really high in concentrations of heavy metals that can sometimes be toxic to plants. So, because of this, over swaths of evolutionary time, serpentine soils have acted as this really powerful biological filter for making it that like only certain types of plants can tolerate these more stressful serpentine soils. And in fact, there are some plant species in California that are only found on serpentine soils. And in order to sort of deal with the lack of nutrients and the heavy metals, serpentine plants have also developed like a remarkable diversity of different ways. Like, do they just tolerate it? Do they have a way to filter the toxic stuff out? And I'm not a plant physiologist, so I can't really speak as much to the specific mechanisms, but I think that's also just like an endlessly fascinating area as well. So because of this, in California, we have these weedy, invasive grasses that have mostly taken over a lot of our landscapes. For those of you watching this who have spent time in California, you might like recall being in California in the summer and driving through the hills, and often you just see a lot of like bleached, dead grass everywhere. And most of that is unfortunately introduced and has kind of displaced what historically likely would have been a lush community of flowers that some of which would still be blooming in the summer. But because these serpentine soils are so harsh, fortunately, the good news is that these invasive grasses that have otherwise taken over a lot of California's grasslands, most of them cannot grow on these serpentine soils. So because of that, serpentine grasslands are this really important refuge for native plant diversity within California. And they're also a window into what California's past ecosystems might have looked like. So within ecology, we call them a refugia because they're sort of this reservoir for all of this biodiversity that's otherwise, unfortunately, been mostly lost from the landscape. And because they have a lot of high plant biodiversity, California as a whole is a world plant diversity hotspot. Serpentine grasslands also harbor remarkably diverse pollinators too. But they occur within these really patchy landscapes. So this is kind of what I alluded to earlier, because sort of the crux of a lot of my dissertation research was how do pollinators as well as potentially floral microbes spill over within these patchy landscapes between serpentine grasslands that are really biodiverse and more invaded non-serpentine grasslands. And so the picture that I have here is from the McLaughlin Reserve in the Coast Range, where I've done a lot of my work up in Northern California by Clear Lake. And the background is a serpentine grassland with mostly native plants, and then the foreground is an invaded non-serpentine grassland. And you can see the color difference in the photo is really showing the stark difference in plant community, and this boundary is really tracing along a geologic fault line within the landscape as well. And pollinators, particularly some of the bumblebees that are in this photo, tend to be these really mobile animals that make really complex foraging decisions, so they can potentially spill over across these serpentine, non-serpentine boundaries in complex ways that can affect potentially the pollination of serpentine plants. So a lot of my research kind of asks that question is like, how much does sort of the context of like how much serpentine versus non-serpentine flowers are on these different sides of these ecosystem boundaries, how does that then affect the pollination? And what we do find is that in a paper that we currently have in revision, we find that like when there's more invasive flowers in the non-serpentine side of the boundary than native wildflowers in the serpentine, we find that the serpentine flowers get less pollinators visiting them. So it's suggesting that this patchiness is really important to understanding pollination. Yeah, so that's kind of an overview of my study system, but then I also wanted to really highlight sort of the approach that I often use in my data to really embrace the complexity and interdependence of life within these grasslands, which is network science. So yeah, before I transition into just sharing a little bit about that, like, yeah, did y'all have any sort of questions about the general study system and questions that I have been working on?
I will at the
Dan, do you have any
end
questions?
at the end of your science section. I will. Thank you.
Cool, awesome,
So, likewise.
great. So essentially, networks are ways of sort of capturing the architecture of species interactions, or in other words, the structure that emerges from them. So if you've never seen a network diagram before, here is a sort of snapshot of some plant pollinator networks that I have from a paper that I currently have in submission. Um, and so the way to interpret these diagrams is that each of the boxes on the top row is a unique species of pollinator that we surveyed in the network. So we would go out and, like, for instance, collect data on which insect do we see landing on which flower, and then we would translate all of that data into a network. And then each of the boxes on the bottom row represents a unique plant species, with the lines between them representing different plant pollinator interactions. And with these particular diagrams, the thicker a particular box or line is, the more frequently we observe that particular species or interaction within the network. And to show sort of an example of why I think networks are really important as a potential tool for both understanding the basic science of, like, complexity within plant pollinator communities, but also for conservation, I wanted to share this figure from a collaborative project that I did with land managers at the reserve where I work in the serpentine grasslands. And essentially, even though I just told you that most invasive species can't grow on serpentine soils, there is unfortunately this one invasive grass called barbed goat grass that likes serpentine soils and then will grow on them, and unfortunately then choke out a lot of the diversity of wildflowers that are there. So the land managers at this reserve did a multi-year experiment where they removed the grass for restoration purposes and then monitored how the pollinators then responded, comparing the control network that I made is for plots where the invasive grass was left in place, and then the restored network was for plots where they, for restoration reasons, removed the invasive grass from the serpentine meadows. So the land managers I was collaborating with were essentially really curious about how their restoration and land management practices were affecting not only the plant community, but whether this could have downstream effects on pollinators. And this is where I think something like a network approach can be really helpful in better understanding that. Because, for instance, just kind of looking at these two networks, even if you don't necessarily know a ton about the math behind networks, you can kind of see that there's a lot more boxes and a lot more lines and more complexity of the different lines within the restored network. So what that's essentially visualizing is that when we remove this invasive grass, we see not only more plant diversity and more pollinator diversity, but also much more diversity of interactions within the plant pollinator network. And then we can then do further calculations to kind of understand how does the structure of the interactions differ between these control networks that have the invasive grass species and the restored networks where we've removed it. And I want to highlight one story from this project in particular. So the yellow boxes in the network are a species called California goldfields. And California goldfields are this native wildflower that are particularly important because they can attract a pretty wide variety of different shapes and sizes of pollinators. So we can then use network math to calculate how important are the goldfields in stabilizing the structure of the network. So essentially what this is measuring is, like, how much do the goldfields attract both generalist pollinators that can visit a bunch of other flower species, but also attract specialist pollinators that might be mostly relying on the goldfields. And when we run the numbers on this, what we find is that the restored networks, the goldfields more strongly contribute to the structure of the network. So essentially what we're showing here is that ecological restoration enhances the role of the goldfields as this really critical network hub for pollinators. So by thinking about things not just as static species that we want to restore or conserve, but as this web of highly interdependent relationships, From a management perspective, we can then think about, okay, maybe for like future restoration efforts, we should prioritize making sure that the goldfields are making a really good comeback within these serpentine meadows, and sort of think about things like that. So that I think is sort of the power of networks as a tool, is that they like help better understand some of these relationships between species that might not be apparent if you're just focused on species more separately, and not in relation to looking at this overall structure that's emerging, and how can we not only conserve individual species, but like having a more complex structure to these plant pollinator relationships. And another example of that too is what we find is that there's also more niche overlap among pollinators in our restored network than in our control network, where the invasive species is left in place. So what that means is that hypothetically, if there's a future disturbance, a restored network where you have multiple pollinators that can have the same niche, or in other words, pollinate the same set of plants, if you lose one of those pollinator species, you still have others that can fulfill that same role. But in the control network, you have not much niche overlap between pollinators. So if you lose a pollinator species due to another future disturbance, hypothetically, then you might have a niche that goes unfilled and that plant doesn't get pollinated. So by using a network approach, we can also try to understand sort of the term for that is functional redundancy, of sort of whether our networks might be more resilient to future disturbances or human impacts as well. So those are just like a couple of the ways that you can use networks as a way of assessing pollinator restoration networks. I'll also sort of share another story, kind of going back to the question of the patches and how the pollinators are spilling over. So I mentioned before that we found that the ratio of invasive non-serpentine flowering plants to native serpentine plants at these different sort of patchy ecosystem boundaries between the serpentine and the non-serpentine grasslands had effects on how many pollinators the different plants were getting, but they also have effects on their role as network hubs as well. So for instance, with these networks, again, each of the boxes on the top are unique pollinator species, and each of the boxes on the bottom are unique plant species. And the purple species vetch is an invasive plant species that primarily only grows on the non-serpentine regular soils. And then the beige species is a special native clover called bull clover that mostly grows on the serpentine soils where the invasive species cannot establish. So these networks are all networks for different meadows that I sampled at that same reserve, where there was a relatively low ratio of invasive to native plants. So in other words, there wasn't that much invasive vetch in the non-serpentine side of the boundary, but the serpentine meadow side of the boundary had a lot of this native clover. And you can see in all of these different networks, for the most part, the clover is acting as sort of this core hub for pollinators. Like, for instance, here I'm highlighting this particular network in the top left had the lowest ratio, so it had very little invasive non-serpentine vetch, and it had a lot of clover in it. And what we find here is that the clover is this really important network hub that, similar to what the goldfields was doing in the other story that I shared, the clover here is playing an important role in attracting a like high diversity of both generalist and specialist insect pollinators. So the clover is this important hub, but then let's see what happens when you look at meadows where that are really invaded, or there's like a high ratio of invasive vetch in the non-serpentine to serpentine clover. So the meadows that I just added to the diagram, they all have a higher invasive to native plant ratio. So the landscape around the serpentine is much more vetchy or much more invaded. And here I've highlighted in red the most invaded of all the meadows, where this meadow had a ton of invasive vetch and very little to no native clover in it. And what we see here is a complete switch, that instead of the clover being this really important hub, we find that instead that the vetch, that is the invasive non-serpentine flower, has replaced the clover as the important hub for specialist and generalist pollinators within the network. Um, so what the takeaway from this story is essentially that, like, the context of the relative abundances of these different plant species on each side of the serpentine non-serpentine boundary is changing which of the plant species are dominant hubs within the network, because a lot of the pollinators are mostly visiting whichever plant species is relatively more abundant. So it's really important to consider the spatial context of what is around a serpentine meadow when thinking about the interactions with pollinators. And we find the same pattern again for another set of plants. So here we have the same exact setup with the ratios and the different meadows, but this time we have another particularly damaging invasive species, yellow star thistle, that I've highlighted in yellow. And then we have a really rare species called the serpentine sunflower that I've highlighted in orange. And the serpentine sunflowers grow only in this one part of California where I work. So they're what's called an endemic plant. And we again see this shift where as you get more of an invaded non-serpentine grassland around your serpentine meadow, you find this functional shift from these native sunflowers on serpentine soils being these really key network hubs to instead the star thistle sort of taking over as that core hub for that's influencing pollinator interactions within the networks. So yeah, that was a lot of information, but essentially, if you take away a couple things from it, it's that networks can really broaden our understanding of insect interactions with other species by having a way of visualizing and quantifying the emergent structure of interactions, and also that it's important to consider space and especially spatial context when thinking about these interactions, because, for instance, in this case, the relative abundances of different plant species on each side of these boundaries is really affecting sort of who acts as key players within the network among the different plant species. And not only do I make a lot of networks of plants and pollinators, but I also want to really highlight the importance of networks of scientists working together collaboratively. So a lot of my remaining work for my dissertation really focused on the effects of adding fertilizer and also the loss of large herbivores on wildflowers. And what made that research possible was a highly collaborative research network called the Nutrient Network that essentially takes the same experiments and replicates that experiment all over the world and using the exact same study design and methods. So what this does is it overcomes the limits of a more like meta-analysis kind of approach, because like traditionally with a meta-analysis, you might compare a bunch of different studies done around the world, but they all would have had slightly different methods or sampling, so that can limit how much you can compare them. Whereas this is essentially by using the same methods all over the world, we can ask, are there global patterns that are generalizable in how wildflowers respond to some of these global changes. And I wanted to share a recent paper that I have published with many awesome colleagues that I collaborated on with this through the Nutrient Network, showing that, yeah, adding extra nutrients is really bad for wildflowers, but the good news is that having large wild mammal herbivores in the grasslands can really rescue the wildflowers from some of these effects. So, yeah, in addition to networks as quantitative tools, I also think a lot about networks of support and collaboration in terms of the relationships that I build with different colleagues to sort of look at science on a more global scale. And with that, to wrap up my science section, I just want to thank some additional collaborators on some of the research that I shared, particularly my PhD advisors, Susan Harrison and Fernanda Valdivinos, as well as Paul Agner and Kathy Kohler at the McLaughlin Reserve, and Sabine Dritz, and also Neil Williams for all of their support on some of the previous science that I shared today.
Thank you, Becca. Awesome. Okay, I could ask a question, or Tucker could ask his first in this sort of Q&A interlude, and then we'll go into poetry and beyond. Do you want to ask one first, Tucker?
Yeah, great. I'd love to. So, yeah, thank you for sharing all that. Really, there was like a yesterday of what I knew about certain aspects of entomology, and there will be a tomorrow. And what you shared today has really informed that. So that's great. So that's someone who's interested in large mammal herbivory. I've worked on cow farms and horse farms, and a dream of building sort of agroecological food systems. Do you know why the introducing or having large mammalian herbivores has this positive effect on restoring damaged landscapes from over-nutrification?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So a lot of it has to do with the grasses. So it can definitely vary depending on how much the herbivore likes to eat grass. But essentially what happens when you dump fertilizer in, um, grasses really like that, and grasses can grow really fast. They're often a lot taller than wildflowers. So what tends to happen is when you dump nutrients, the grasses grow really fast, they grow really tall, and they shade out the slower growing, shorter wildflowers that need sort of more open light in order to grow. So then you start to see more and more grass and fewer diversity of species, and then also just less diversity and abundance of wildflowers as these under fertilizer, as these landscapes get much more grassy. And because a lot of large herbivores fortunately love munching on grass as a main food source, if you put herbivores into the landscape, they will munch the grass and eat it, and that will then have sort of this regulating effect on the plant community because it will create more, open up more light, and sort of release the wildflowers from competition with the grasses for both below ground resources and light. So you often will fortunately then get a rebound in wildflower abundance and diversity.
Awesome. Dan, let's hear it.
Sure. My question on this, as you reflect upon your graduate school, look into the next phase, is so many different kinds of studies are invoked, and you got to experience several different kinds in grad school, like natural experiment, interventions, maybe meta-analyses. So what does it look like to put those puzzle pieces together? Where do other things like bioinformatics fit into it? How do we bring all of these different pieces together to make unified, useful ecosystem models that are of multiple scales?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And yeah, I think that definitely what I learned is like you're saying, the importance of like integration of both bioinformatics, experimental and observational data, natural history knowledge, theoretical models, like all of those different pieces ended up providing more insights into the sort of overarching picture of how pollinators are responding to global changes. And if I had like looked at any of them more in isolation, I don't think I would have arrived at as holistic a conclusion. So for I'm going to be starting a postdoc fellowship at Michigan State, and I'm really hoping to sort of get at that more sort of integrative level of like really trying to weave together these different sources of information, through collaborative science to really get at like a bigger picture of, particularly in agro ecosystems, how are plants and pollinators responding to agricultural disturbances, and are there certain ways that we can have a win-win for both agriculture and pollinator conservation by introducing certain management practices into farmlands. So for my postdoc, I'm going to be collaborating with some below ground scientists, some microbial ecologists, and yeah, essentially trying to combine models, data, bioinformatics, long-term ecological experiments to really look at sort of like our below ground interactions affecting pollinators, such as some of the insects and other invertebrates that live in the soil. Like, do they have downstream effects that then affect pollinators and their dispersal through the landscape? Looking at the microbes and more of the bioinformatics as well. So yeah, I'm going to be collaborating with Nick Haddad and Christine Sprunger, as well as Sarah Evans at Michigan State. So yeah, stay tuned, because yeah, that is taking that more integrative approach is something that I'm really excited to do.
Well, thank you. As we pivot now to the second poetic section, what I will remark on, Becca, and what I really appreciate is you frame it in terms of not what is known by science or known by you or anyone, but about what questions we're seeking, who we're working on them with, how we're pursuing it, and we're just talking about it. The papers and the data sets and everything are the real artifact. So it's just a very concise way that's very deliberate, and I think speaks also to the integration with perhaps some artistic directions and personal explorations and communications. So please continue into this section.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that sums it up. Like, yeah, for me, science is very much a process more so than just like a static outcome, and like the process of how you generate those questions, the sort of like, yeah, I don't really see it as something that neatly wraps up, but more like something that ends with even more and more questions, and that sort of engagement with different scientists, both current and across time, to really sort of build on those different questions. And I think that same questions driven approach also really inspires me as a poet and an artist as well. So I'm now going to share some poems, as well as I have some nature photography and some watercolors that I've made to accompany my poems. And I've tried to choose poems that are reflective of like the places that I've worked in California grasslands, as well as other grasslands that I've lived in. Because I think like both poetry and entomology, although they seem very different, I think there's sort of this thread that connects them of really taking the time to ask questions and pay attention to what's around you, because I think they both provide two very different lenses through which you can really kind of connect with sort of the broader web of life and with other people, and kind of really start to sort of have attention and care for a particular place, be it the place you live, the place you work, a particular grassland in California that I might feel a deep connection to, for instance. So yeah, this first poem is called Refugium, and it kind of builds on the idea that I shared earlier, that serpentine grasslands are these important refugia for a lot of California's plant diversity biologically, but also the idea that refugium can be a place where you feel a deep sense of interconnection and belonging. So I'll read it. Refugium. The light you hold makes the small tree flower among split scree and tangled cypress, so that a chorus of bees fills the air, so sweetness settles on ashen soil, so that everything is okay from a long way off. In the scattered dazzle, hummingbirds blur between petals, almost snow but gentle, blankets the cliffs in a soft, bright shower.
Awesome. How about Tucker, one short reflection on this poem? Then I'll provide one short one so we can just read a few poems and just give one short reflection each.
Well, I read this when you shared it via email, and really like the word of the use scree. That stood out to me because it's one of these words that maybe you'd only come across as a hard scientist or as a committed poet. And that speaks to that collaboration between the two that you were alluding to. So yeah, I love it.
Thank you.
The part that stands out to me is the chorus, new line of bees, because the chorus is their singing, and the group is a chorus, like choral music, but also a chorus is a repeating part of a song. So it is repeating and it's multiple, and it's split with a new line.
Thanks. Here's another poem I'd like to share, and this one also appears in Deep Wild magazine. And this one's called Coast Range, which is the name of the mountain range where I've done a lot of my work on plants and pollinators. So I will read this one. No landscape without the body to define its edges, skin against rough, fire-scarred bark, feet sore and damp with needles, prickled lichen, brushes hands, rocks, scree clatters, a woman alone with clouded sulfur butterflies and scrub jays. I follow the dry creek bed, wind rattles low and silver over Avena grass stalled heat. Here I expand to blue, bold hills, cup the power of past rivers between my lips, smooth stones I carry. I ramble into sun-sharp thistle, bare tracks press into green, gray soil. The spine of the mountains shuffles yerba santa, sweet air, brightness. I bathe in sunlight and dust, exposed roots snake past me.
Okay, Tucker, want to give a first thought?
Okay, my niece is screaming in the background, but this really reminds me of California chaparral and being in those incredible liminal landscapes between a lush boreal environment and the dry scrub land, walking up the dry creek bed. Yeah, you really put me right back there. Love it.
Okay. First, it reminds me of a high school backpacking experience that I won't go into. But on the previous slide, Becca, the beginning of this poem is like a poetic expression of embodiment and enactment. So the kinds of things that there's so many papers about animals have bodies and ecology is spatial for e-cognition. And so it just speaks to different ways of knowing and experiencing, and field work and adventuring is a very different way of knowing. And it's one thing to think about the whole world in just terms of data distributions over space, and that can be disembodying, or it leads to abstraction. It's map territory, but you can map the whole world, but then when it comes down to it, it's just like you are just who you are in that spot, seeing what you see, and that's the ultimate limitation, but there's more than enough within that little cone that isn't picked up. It's what's abstracted over when larger scale, like data-driven models are created.
Thank you. Yeah, I think those are both really good points. And yeah, kind of definitely something that inspired me when writing this poem was just sort of my own experience within the landscapes where they work and sort of, yeah, I think especially too from a conservation standpoint, I think like data is essential, but I think what really like where that spark is that it's going to like motivate interest in conservation and in protecting the places that we care about is more of that like deeper level presence and attachment and engagement within in certain places like the chaparral of California. Here's another poem I wrote, and this one is called Canyon Live Forever. And to give a little context about the title, Canyon Live Forever is the plant that's pictured on the slide. It's a small little succulent that often grows out of bare rock outcrops and is found throughout California. Canyon Live Forever. Cling to this barren, lunar home offered. Withstand fire after fire in company of lichen. Blaze to petal, hummingbird, the creek's silver thread. Root down strong to bedrock, cooled fault lines. Give peace to these hills in luminous glow. Breathe sunlight and rise from stone.
Well, I love the fact that, for one, I love the name Canyon Live Forever. I had no idea this plant was called that. Really fantastic. You don't come across many plants that have a common name like that. And the fact that it almost like recapitulates the fire that it's so good at coexisting with. Yeah, just so vibrant and dense with life. Yeah, fantastic.
For me, the shape of the stanza, and they each have 3 lines, and they have 3 words, or there's a lot of sound. So just what is the experience of that view on? Because a different poet at that same field site would have seen it, said it. You would have seen it and said it differently later. So what can be really used in structure with few words so that there's more space to read between the lines? Because it's all between the lines.
Thank you. Yeah, for sure. No, for this one in particular, I wanted to leave a lot of space between the lines for interpretation or hopefully connection. Yeah, I just find this particular plant species really incredible. It tends to attract a lot of pollinators of certain kinds, but it also just the fact that you find it growing in these really sort of stark, just like sometimes right out of just what to me seems like solid rock without even really much of a soil. Often in these really incredibly dry, arid landscapes, and you find these little pockets of the canyon live forever that's just somehow managing to grow there and thrive. Like, yeah, I think that was something that really spoke to me when I was out in the field. It's one of the plants that sometimes appears in the networks that I study. And yeah, I have a real soft spot for this plant.
Austerity, which, as Daniel points out, also comes up in the poem structure. That vibrancy plus the austerity, yeah, it's so beautiful.
Thanks. Here's another poem called Dry Season, and I've accompanied it with a photo I took when I was out doing field work in the summertime when it's often a really dry time of year when you have to be concerned about fires, and particularly with climate change, there's been increasing variation of rainfall in the places I work, including they've experienced some pretty extreme drought events. So this poem kind of explores that, but more from the sort of perspective of how one interacts with the landscape during such times of drought. Dry season. Drought on your lips, barefoot in the fractured mud, you arrive into parched blue, dawn, drawn to the jagged spaces, fragmentary seeds, spent to dust, wishbone, dandelion. When words collapse, what stays? Leaves for which you have no name, shining, solitary, starry vines trail down into ruptured light. The body's chrysalis, bound to wild, broken, starts to sing.
Yeah, body's chrysalis. Wow. These poems have made me think about Wittgenstein and the idea of like the observer. Does a tree fall when a tree falls? Does it make any noise if no one there is there to hear it? That came up in the first poem you shared, or the second poem rather, about if a landscape only exists if there's a body there to define it. So yeah, maybe you could speak to briefly if that's been inspiration, that play between observer, because I noticed you put yourself in these poems too. There's an observer here. Really beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that definitely really resonates with me because I think like often when writing a poem like this, I think there's sort of multiple levels of sort of the poet as the observer and sort of her engagement with sort of her surroundings. I think that a lot of my poems really sort of bubble up from experiences where I really try to pay attention to sort of the world that I'm in and what seems to sing or speak to me at a given moment in time when I'm really sort of thinking about the trees or watching the insects and very much stepping away from the buzz of my own thoughts to really kind of open my mind to sort of engaging with the other than human world around me. And I think also too when writing this, I was thinking both about sort of engaging with drought and sort of the feelings of climate change related events as a person that's navigating these places that I feel really strongly attached to, but also sort of that visceral feeling of its impact on insects and on plants and sort of how those two impacts of both drought on people but also on ecosystems are sort of intertwined on this very primal visceral level. And yeah, I think that's something I think about from more of a social ecological systems thinking kind of perspective with research, but also on a more sort of emotional, more primal level. Yeah, I think that there's often this feeling when walking through a really drought affected landscape that I can like feel the impact on both my own body, but also on seeing these insects still trying to go to flowers even though it's really hot and dry out, and just seeing how much the plant community has changed compared to a rainier year.
Thank you. The part that brings up a field experience for me is you arrive into parched blue, new line, dawn, because it's like leaving the field site, leaving for the field site in the dark, or biking to campus in the dark, and you know yesterday was dry, but you don't know how today is going to be, and then arriving there as the sun is rising, and it's like already blue skies minutes into the day and the temperature raises faster and it's just going to be a hot day, and it's hot for you and it's hot for the microbes and it's hot for the insects and the plants, and to have all of that and you get to go home or into a tent but they're going to be out there, and how that happens day after day, year after year. So where do bodies go?
Thank you. Yeah, no, exactly. I think that definitely very much was kind of some of the things I was like thinking about as I was writing this. And it also takes me back to I feel like when we were all sort of spending time together in the field in Arizona, I think you had at one point said to me something along the lines of like the Southwestern Research Station being and its surrounding ecosystem being not just a place but also a state of mind. And yeah, kind of what you were saying about like arriving into a field site, it can sometimes feel like you're entering another world or sort of another state of being and engaging with the land through the sort of attention and detail that goes into doing ecological field work. um, Yeah, here's another one about another really iconic California wildflower, the bull tube iris. Um, yeah, this iris blooms in the spring. You can often find it throughout a lot of grasslands in Northern California. And here, yeah, this poem sort of is about kind of this particular iris and sort of some of the feelings that it evoked in me. Bull tube iris. In streaked sun and meadow, your afterglow and open shine, pulses kaleidoscopic in bunchgrass before winter's first blade. You breathe bulbs into cold, deep ground, leave indigo dreams to unfurl in spring, dazzle us, spangled with dew.
Tucker first.
Yeah, for me, this really captures the awe that I feel, that we feel before nature. This little plant digging into the ground, and then to describe its future life force as an indigo dream, that captures perfectly how easy and compelling and true it is to let us fall into like the mysticism of it. So, and my little tiny niece seems to agree.
Thank you.
I like the breathing in and out of the plant and the below ground time scale that's slower, but it really does, like a taproot, flows down, grows out, and then it pulls back in. So great time scales.
Thanks. Yeah, that was definitely, I think, something that bubbled up for me when I was writing this was just sort of like the cyclical nature of seasons. And I think often when we interact with time, or at least when I interact with time, it's like I'm an academic and I'm busy and I have so many things in my calendar, and I'm kind of like time is more being goal posted by the quarter or the semester of the school year and things like that. And it feels a little more removed from just like the rhythm of plants and also the rhythm of weather as it changes. And I think like definitely like this plant would often bloom towards the beginning of my field season every spring, and like something about really stepping out into the different grasslands I was surveying, and seeing this plant coming up and sort of all of the vibrancy and life that evoked for me. I think, yeah, it had this kind of, yeah, both like you said, awe-inspiring, but also reassuring feeling of the fact that there's this recurrence of plants, and also that there's other ways to feel the passage of time and engage with it beyond a calendar that's full, especially just like getting to return to the same patch of plants like every day for a month or more, and really see subtle changes. And like yesterday, these were buds, now they're flowers. A few more weeks, they're gonna all go to seed, and disperse their seeds out into the world. Like, yeah, that kind of more personal, intimate sense of time, I think, is something that is also kind of a parallel between both the sort of process of doing field work as a pollinator ecologist, but also the kind of sense of time that like really sparks my imagination as a poet, and thinking about time as more in these like cyclical ways that are more connected to sort of how time is then shaping the ecosystem with changes in which plants and pollinators are around as the season develops.
Yeah, and I just would like to make one more point. Some of your poems focus on the landscape, and some of them you take the poetic lens and zoom down onto a single species like the Live Canyon Forever, or Canyon Live Forever, or this bowl tube iris. And it really brings out the fact that, like an iris, a single flower holds the whole universe within it. It's an ecosystem unto itself. And as you blew our minds earlier, not only is it a whole ecosystem of itself, it contains ecosystems like those little tiny balls of nectar that themselves are worlds in into themselves, and so on all the way down, and so on all the way up. And so you've kind of given us this kaleidoscopic view of poetic subjects to appreciate even more that fractal, nested nature of capital N nature. So yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
I'll read
All
just
right.
I'll read
Oh
just
yeah, go
one.
for it, Dan.
William Blake. One line is, "The hours of folly are measured by the clock, but of wisdom no clock can measure." And then another Blake line fragment is, "Time is a pulsation of an artery that contains an age."
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I think that yeah, I think those are some really powerful lines. Thanks for sharing those fragments of Blake, and yeah, I think they just kind of speak to like, I think what's really cool and subversive about poetry is that it can kind of really mess with or kind of challenge maybe some of the sort of ways in which we think about time or experience time, or kind of like pull us into some of those sort of broader ways of thinking about time, sort of maybe beyond sort of the day-to-day experience of like, oh, I have so many hours and I have work or other obligations. And yeah, it's just like a very different way of connecting with time. And here's one more poem. This time I want to sort of more bring us to the prairies of the Midwest. So this poem is called Tornado, and I was really thinking about a lot of the tall grass prairies around where I grew up when writing it. And it's about prairies and weather, but also about like what it means as a woman to stand up for yourself and really be unapologetically yourself. And I think a lot about this with science and sort of its history as a field. So Tornado. To be a woman with a mind turbulent as a wayward hawk from a place of ice, glazed fields, night, skies with every color. Call it witchcraft, a woman making her way here, speaking up to thunder, rattlesnake master, gyre of prairie whirls under her footfalls as she runs into green static air towards aspens, shape shifting, wit as quicksilver, unyielding. Everything changed in her path, wildered.
Yeah, not only are we braiding sweetgrass, we're kicking up tiny tornadoes with our footfall. It's not magic in the sense that it's not real, but it's magic because it is so real. It's like it's our participation in and as a part of nature that really gives us a real power and a real sense of meaning and depth and magic. Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Thanks.
For me, it's a callback to the outer ecologies from the first part of the talk and the inner ecologies and how to hold room for there being all of the colors and phenomena as an internal journey that's happening under constraints.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that sums it up really well. And yeah, I think definitely is a nice segue back to how we started our conversation today. Because yeah, I think a lot of sort of that balance between like engagement with the external world, but also the interior experience and sort of the ways in which those interact. Particularly with, yeah, it was something I was thinking about when writing this poem and thinking about tornadoes and prairies.
Awesome. Do you have any other poems, or does this bring us to our closing section?
I think this brings up into some of our closing section, yeah. But also, if we have time at the end, I can definitely find some more on my computer too, or I'm happy to chat more too about just like the process of writing poems, what that involves, how that intersects with science.
I'm very curious about the bumblebee conservation that you've dangled. So maybe just show us what is here briefly. Then Tucker and I can each ask like one more question that might be related to the research, to the art, to the future of entotech, all the above.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I wanted, since a lot of this talk was focused on sort of human impacts on the environment and the fact that, like, yeah, we have to sort of conserve pollinators, but there's all these reasons why pollinators are unfortunately declining due to things like um, landscape intensification into like agriculture or loss of habitat more broadly or pesticide use. And it can seem really bleak. So I wanted to share as we move towards the end of our time together today, sort of a more positive story about bumblebee conservation that I've been engaged in, and also a story that involves one of my favorite insect species, if not my favorite. So I'd like you all to meet the Crotch's bumblebee, or Bombus crotchi. It's an imperiled bumblebee species that is more or less found only in the state of California, and it has a very silly sounding name. It's named after an entomologist of days past, whose last name was Crotch. So that's the story behind the name. Because I always get a lot of questions from people about the name, like, or you study the crotch bee? Like, I've had people ask me that, and they're like, "What's the deal with this bee? Why does it have this name?" But anyway, yeah, it's a cool bee, and it's found throughout much of California, but it's really drastically declined due to habitat losses, and especially in Northern California, there's not as much as there was historically of the Crotch's bumblebee. And the state of California is currently in the process of figuring out should we formally list this as an endangered species. And in order to even potentially do that at a state level, there was a whole legal saga um, back and forth that happened. That where the Stanford Law Clinic got involved in trying to help them, and essentially, in order to like make this potentially an endangered species, these bumblebees were legally declared fish in the state of California. So even though they're biologically not fish, for legal reasons, in order to potentially protect them with policies, they are now officially fish. So you may or may not have encountered some memes or some news stories about that if you're listening to this and have been following environmental policy in California in the news lately. But they tend to come out in the mid to late spring. They're also really large bumblebees. The queens can be like about this big, and they sound like little airplanes taking off. Like they have a much deeper buzz than some of the other bumblebees. And the reason I feel such a connection to them is my first year of doing PhD field work at the McLaughlin Reserve. Um, One of the reserve directors had mentioned to me that he had started seeing this bee species on the reserve, and that it was the first time, at least, that he had noticed it in the area. Um, so I kind of felt like, so he said to keep an eye out for it, and then I started seeing it visit some of the species that I study, like the vetch and the clover and the thistle and the sunflowers. So it felt like kind of a chapter was starting for both this bee species as well as for my own journey through grad school. And that, yeah, it was like this bee showed up right when I started my field work. So that just seemed like a real serendipitous kind of confluence of timing. And then throughout the like 4.5-ish years that I did my PhD and beyond, I've been helping monitor this bee at the McLaughlin Reserve. Um, yeah, and just kind of keeping tabs on it and like collaborating with different groups like the Xerces Society and the California Fish and Wildlife, and also sharing information on its basic natural history to different consultants and agency scientists. Because, yeah, with this, a lot of what we don't know about it stems down to just like there was a lot that we didn't know about its basic natural history of like where it likes to hang out and what it does and its nesting ecology and when it reproduces. So I think that also the story of this bee is like a good case for why natural history really matters as a form of knowledge. And as we continue to develop all of these amazing technologies for studying insects, I think the fusion of like new technological advances with deep natural history knowledge can be a really powerful potential approach to insect conservation. And one really exciting find was that, yeah, very little was known about the nesting ecology of this bee. A lot of the conservation planning around nesting habitat was assumed from similar bee species. And one day, I was out with a field technician who I was working with, KT Lynch, and KT was looking around and noticed a hole in the ground and a bee moving out of the hole. So we decided to take a closer look, and the hole turned out to be a nest of the Crotch's bumblebee. And at the time that we encountered this nest, which is this little, you can kind of see in the video, it's that little dark hole in the grass next to where the purple owl's clover is, and there's a Bombus crotchy worker that's kind of flying around on some poppies. And eventually, if you watch closely in the video, she'll scoop into the nest. But yeah, at the time we stumbled upon this nest, this was one of only, I think, 3 nests that had ever been observed and documented in the recorded science record. So it was like kind of, yeah, yeah, she just went into the nest, and there's the entrance to it. So it was kind of like a big surprise to find one, because it was kind of this mystery of like, where do they nest? And in this case, it seems like they decided to nest in an abandoned rodent burrow, in the middle of a large calcium carbonate seep full of wildflowers. So it provided this great opportunity to just document some baseline natural history about what their sort of nesting behavior and habitat looked like. So we spent a lot of time watching the bees going in and out of the nest and recording like how frequently they enter and leave to try to get a feel for like how active it was. And this was just kind of by pure luck that we stumbled upon it. So yeah, to give a little more background for maybe those less familiar with like bumblebee nests, like often even for really common bumblebee species, it can take like hours and hours of searching to find a bumblebee nest. To find one for a rare species like this one is kind of like looking for a needle in a haystack, because when the queens are often starting to establish a nest, you can try to follow them around, but they will often just zoom off. So like, yeah, we have a lot of need right now for technologies that can better help us detect these nests, because a lot of it is just from just like luck, like in our case, or just like having to rigorously spend a lot of hours searching. Community science platforms like iNaturalist can also be really vital too, by increasing just the number of people out there looking for nests and sharing them. So yeah, this was just kind of exciting and encouraging to find this nest. I feel really lucky to be one of the few people on Earth that had the opportunity to interact really closely with a Crotch's bumblebee nest and learn about it. So yeah, I kind of wanted to wrap up some of our discussion today, kind of just sharing this fun story about how we found this nest and documented it, and then tried to share the natural history info that we learned with different conservation practitioners to really highlight that like natural history is super important, and there's a need to like better understand things like this. And I think like definitely technology potentially has the possibility of increasing the chances that we have these kinds of special encounters. And yeah, Bombus crotchy is an amazing bumblebee, and yeah, it's definitely one that a lot of conservation efforts are focusing on right now in California.
Thank you. Tucker and I will each ask one question. There's so many things to go into, so we'll just pick one, and that will be a great discussion. So, Tucker, do you want to go first?
Why don't you go first on this one, Dan?
Okay. So, that was a very riveting case study of where entotech could come into play in the way that we're kind of thinking about ecosystem services and valuation and all of this. Like, how could we understand where different insects live and what micro niches they like? There's that basic natural history question. And then if we had a more integrated way to understand value and risk in ecosystems, and we could better understand the value and meaning that these organisms provide and their network position and all of this, then there could be a more direct path from understanding the natural history and, oh, it's within this many feet of this, but not that, or it is on this boundary between this and that, and take that all the way on through to how we evaluate what's worth doing where. So that's just what overall all these different avenues are making me think. I guess, what are you most excited to do in your postdoc? where can pollination tech and entotech and all of these other methods get us in like 2 to 3 years?
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think one thing I've been curious about is, so I think I had mentioned earlier for my postdoc, I'm like curious about opportunities that might be a win-win for both farmers and for prairie restoration. So I'm going to be working in these experiments where we have these strips of native prairie plants called prairie strips that are like interspersed throughout these otherwise really agriculture intensive landscapes. And I'm really curious, kind of going back to my general theme of like the world being patchy, and to like embrace the messiness and the complexity around patchy landscapes. I'm curious how pollinators and their associated floral microbes might spill over between flowering crops like cherries or canola flowers and these little strips of native prairie plants that are placed within agricultural landscapes, and how that spillover might shape both the network of interactions between plants and pollinators and microbes that emerge, but also like by having these prairie strips from a more applied standpoint, are we both bringing back more biodiversity into the landscape while still having benefits for crop yields for farmers? And yeah, essentially creating that like win-win kind of scenario there. And I think where it'd be cool to see some technological advances is that, like, I'm hoping that maybe we see some more development of technology around tracking bees. Like, I know there's some work being done to try to place little like chips onto bees that can like track their locations the same way that ornithologists have done from bird migrations, where they've placed little sensors on migratory birds and been able to create these really incredibly moving maps of like where a particular bird might go across big distances. But I think because pollinators are smaller, it's often a challenge to develop these technologies, especially for use in a more of a field setting outside of a controlled environment where you have wild pollinators moving around. But I think if we could develop better tools for tracking where bees are going across the landscape, like I think that could further help us understand these processes of how bees spill over across these different ecosystem boundaries, and provide us with more sort of granular data on like where are they spending their time. Are they like spending equal time, for instance, in a field of crops as a nearby patch of prairie strips? Are they mostly really honing in on certain plants within the prairie areas, and mostly just using the rest of the landscape for getting from those patches of those plants to the other, and not really stopping? Like, I think a lot of that's often assumed, but from looking at patterns of visitation or trying to trace the flow of pollen, but I think there could really be a renaissance in like more technological tools involving cameras and sensors that could potentially be sort of another additional way of getting at these questions, and creating more maps of how the bees are moving around. Like, I think if there's a way to do that, that would be really help advance our understanding of these questions of pollinator movement, especially in relation to conservation and services to crops.
Thank
Yeah,
you. And
my
Tucker.
response to that is my response to that is stay tuned. We're trying to build
Ooh.
Entotech slowly but surely, and it's thanks to great research, field research like the kind that you're doing, that we're gaining more and more inspiration. Um, Let me think. My question is a little bit more general, but we've talked a lot about pollinators today. Just to tie this back to our mutual tripartite love of ants, can you say something briefly about your work with ants in the context of these pollinators, or if you're mostly focusing on flying pollinators?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, like, we do definitely get some ants on the flowers as well, though they less clear within this particular system if the ants are moving around pollen or mostly nectaring on the flowers, but there are some really cool systems where ants are like essential pollinators for certain flowers too. But I think kind of segueing back to like the initial work that I had done as an undergrad tech working with Dr. Deborah Gordon and y'all out in the Southwest, like I think like the skills definitely translate. And I still, for fun, even if they aren't in my networks, watch ants all the time when I find them in my neighborhood. And I think like working within that research space really kind of instilled a love for like the process of just watching an insect and trying to see where that insect goes, kind of thinking about its behavior as sort of being an important driver to the outcome of different species interactions. So yeah, I still, yeah, even if the ants are not as much a central focus compared to the bees, like they're all hymenopterans, they're all very cool. I love ants too.
Agreed. Hold on, sorry. Sorry, I'm on the phone. Sorry, that's my niece. Sorry. Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing that, and I'll let Dan finish it off. But thank you personally, Becca. This has been actually mind-blowing from an entomological point of view and
Oh,
beautiful poetry.
thanks. That's so kind of you.
Yeah. Do you have any last comments or anything else you want to add? Becca?
Yeah, I guess. Oh yeah, yeah. So I guess I can just briefly show you that my some fun bird photos. Like my other love when I'm not an entomologist is I just like to watch birds for fun. And for instance, here's a yellow-headed blackbird that I recently encountered on a trip to Utah. A sandhill crane flying over mountains in Utah. This is a sharp-tailed grouse. And then, yeah, some of my favorite like Davis bird highlights. One time there was a long-eared owl near where I lived. I get Anna's hummingbirds a lot. This bittern is like a very hard to find bird because it likes to hide in the marsh and pretend to be a plant. And yeah, northern shoveler is one of my favorite ducks. But yeah, I just like want to highlight that I think like birds were kind of my gateway into ecology. And yeah, even I guess sometimes I do get hummingbirds in my networks, but yeah, even though I mostly am an entomologist, outside of work, I spend a lot of time birding. And I think like, yeah, even for those listening that are like not someone that is watching insects or watching animals for their job, I think there's like lots of ways either through bird watching or through looking for insects as a hobby entomologist that you can like contribute to the scientific process and have these sort of deep immersive encounters in nature as well. And you don't have to have a PhD in entomology or ecology to have those experiences. Like, yeah, any sort of interaction with the outside or with wild critters, like, yeah, that's something that I think can be sort of engaged with across many different disciplines or life experiences.
Great comments. So much I could add. Lots of fun stories and fun times. Hanging out in Davis, field work at Stanford, swerves. So fun to have all of this presentation. Thank you for being our second guest on Talktoptera. Till
Thank
next
you so
time.
much. Thank you.
See you.
Take care.
Bye, Becca.
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll reconnect with you at some point soon. Have a great day.
Sounds wonderful. You too. Yeah, it was an honor to get to chat with y'all today. Best wishes.
Likewise.